Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football, the five most underrated football players for this Texas A&M program heading into 2025. One of my, favorite conversations to have where a lot of the offseason conversation around these football teams goes to the star talent, which look, rightfully so, having that top end star talent is very important in this sport, but what's the difference between good teams and great teams? I think you could argue that what does the rest of the roster look like? What do the role players look like for your program? That can often be the difference between being a good team and being a great team. And that's obviously where Texas A&M is, where hey, we're trying to take that next step in terms of being a great team in college football. And one of the things that I really kind of became a little bit more clear as I was kind of prepping this episode is we might be looking at the biggest difference between Texas A&M under Jimbo Fisher and Texas A&M under Mike Elko, where Jimbo Fisher was so concerned about top end talent that the meat and potatoes of the roster, the other 80% of the roster, was nowhere near where it needed to be. Mike Elko is going to have top end talent. Texas A&M is going to be a program that acquires top end talent. You're going to see that in the NFL draft. Texas A&M probably going to have a couple of draft picks that are top 100 picks. But the depth of this roster, the meat and potatoes of this roster, to me, it seems so much better than where it was under Jimbo Fisher. And that probably excites me the most about what Mike Elko is doing with this program, where you start putting together this list and say, a lot of football players that, look, we've talked a lot of Texas A&M football over the last couple of weeks. There are going to be some players that we talk about right now that we haven't talked about all winter long. And these guys are good football players, at least in my opinion. Want to get into the five names before we get into it, as always, to the Texas A&M fans. There's a lot of other names that could be included in this list. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Gonna be a really fun spring practice window for Texas A&M. Obviously, a lot of new personnel coming into this program. Appreciate you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with probably the most underappreciated football player on this team, and quite frankly, one of the most important football players on this team going into 2025. That's Albert Regis. Albert Regis last year quietly played 500 snaps for Texas A&M on the defensive line. He led all defensive linemen with 20 run stops in the 2024 year. I mean, think about the defensive linemen that Texas A&M had. It was not a bad unit. They had a lot of guys that are going to be playing on Sundays in the next couple of months. Albert Regis led this unit in run stops, was third on the team in run stops with 20. To me, I look at Albert Regis and say, McKinley Jackson light is probably the best way I could describe him, where he's probably definitely not as big, probably not as disruptive, but does a lot of the dirty work that McKinley Jackson did for Texas A&M as well. Kind of fire hydrant build, eats up double teams, can win at the point of attack. Albert Regis is never going to be a guy that goes for 8+ sacks and 10+ TFLs, but he's a force in the middle of the defensive line. And you look at why this is so important. Look, I don't have that many question marks about the roster of Texas A&M. If I did have one question mark, it's probably the middle of that defensive line. Do we have good enough and do we have enough bodies on the middle of that defensive line? If you get a step from Albert Regis, that's huge for Texas A&M answering the biggest question mark they have on this roster heading into 2025. And he's a guy that, quite frankly, played a lot of good football for Texas A&M. Just nobody talked about him because you had guys like Shamar Stewart and Shamar Turner and Nick Scorton that played really good football. Number two, I'm going to go to the transfer portal and talk about Jordan Shaw. This is another position where Texas A&M has the chance to take a massive step in the right direction. You go back to Jaden Hill last year. Jaden Hill struggled. 73% completion percentage given up in coverage, was targeted over 58 times in the 2024 year, missed 18% of his tackles. Jordan Shaw comes in, probably going to start at that nickel cornerback spot, at least compete with the guy like Tyreek Chappelle. Jordan Shaw last year, 61% completion percentage given up, very good number for a nickel corner, only missed 9% of his tackles, and a guy that's getting better. Like, what's the biggest difference between Jaden Hill and Jordan Shaw? Jaden Hill was going to be a fifth-year senior when he got to Texas A&M. We kind of knew he wasn't going to be all of a sudden become an all SEC guy. We saw enough of him at Florida where he was solid, but we knew he wasn't going to be great. And Jordan Shaw was really dang good for Washington in 2024 as a second-year guy. He's only going into his third year coming to Texas A&M. There's a chance that Jordan Shaw gets better going into year three. To me, Texas A&M has the opportunity to significantly get better at the nickel corner spot heading into 2025. Number 3, another guy that I think is grossly underrated in the transfer portal, that's Deon Hayes. 12 months ago, Deon Hayes transferred from Pitt to go to Colorado. The 2023 season at Pitt, he was great. He was a second-team All-ACC guy, had 29 quarterback hurries, had 19 run stops. He's very good stopping the run, not to mention 29 quarterback hurries, extremely disruptive as a pass rusher. Plays 4 games for Colorado, season-ending injury. If you get the version of and by the way, the 4 games that we saw him play for Colorado before the injury, he was playing like the Deon Hayes that we saw in 2023. This was not a guy that got to Colorado and didn't play well. If you get the version of Deon Hayes that we saw in 2023 at Pitt, which to me, if he successfully recovers from the offseason injury, you're going to get that. And Deon Hayes is a really good football player. He's a really, really good against the run. He can be disruptive in the pass rush. And again, Texas A&M looking for just bodies and depth on the defensive line. Do not sleep on Deon Hayes being potentially kind of an all-SEC caliber football player for Texas A&M in the 2025 year. Number 4, another guy similar to Albert Regis that just did not get nearly enough love, Koli at center. He was really solid. Didn't even come in as a starter. He was got rotated in at the center position in that week 1 game against Notre Dame. Took over the job for the rest of the year. Started every single game for Texas A&M. Only gave up 1 sack on 398 pass pro sets. This was the biggest storyline for Texas A&M year 1 for Mike Elko, is just this offensive line feeling like a different unit. And if there's one thing to be really optimistic about with Texas A&M going into 2025, it's the continuity of the offensive line. They return pretty much every single starter on that offensive line of a unit that seemingly it just unquestionably got better from 2023 into the 2024 year. What happens if they get better again going into 2025? I've been very vocal that I'm a believer in Adam Cushing. You got a bona fide, rock solid center. And there are a lot of football programs that we talk about going into spring practice that have significant question marks on the offensive line. You don't have that for Texas A&M. Now the question is, how good can they be? Because we look at this offensive line and say, I know it's going to be solid. It was solid last year. They returned pretty much everybody. A unit that is clearly trending in the right direction. How good can they be is that question. And Koli, I think, is going to play a really big part along with the guy and Armaj Reed Adams. Texas A&M's evals in the transfer portal last year were pretty damn good. Like, both guys that they plugged and played on the offensive line through the portal really turned out to be good football players. Last one on the list, Cashius Howell, who the Texas A&M fans who follow this program and watched every football game, y'all know how good he is. In terms of the national media, not enough people are talking about him. He's, to me, one of the best pure edge rushers in the SEC going into 2025. And what excites me the most about Cashius Howell is he's going to have a little bit more opportunity. Now, I think he needs to be a little bit more of a force in the run game. One of the things we loved about Shamar Stewart and Nick Scoren is they could also really get done in the run game for the most part. There was some inconsistencies. Cashius Howell is a little bit smaller, a little bit, I don't know if the word is less physical, but just a guy that is not as much of a presence in terms of his physicality because he's a little bit smaller. But as a pure pass rusher, you look at Cashius Howell's numbers, 24 quarterback hurries last year, a 19.9% pass rush win rate. That 19% pass rush win rate was better than Shamar Stewart, was better than Nick Scoren. As a pure pass rusher, there's an argument to be made that he was the best pass rusher on this Texas A&M defense last year. Now going year 2 in the SEC, certainly could be that guy again. There's a lot of guys that I feel like this Texas A&M program in general just has so many guys that are kind of flying under the radar that could be great football players for them in the 2025 year. And that's kind of my overall take after kind of completing this episode is the depth of this roster is in a significantly better spot than it was under Jimbo Fisher, where Jimbo Fisher had all these flashy names, and quite frankly, even the flashy names didn't really turn out to be that much of difference makers for this program. The meat and potatoes, you look top to bottom on this roster and say, from a depth standpoint, this team's in a way better spot. And now it's about having these guys step up and give you that top end talent in the SEC. We'll see how it turns out. A lot of underrated football players. These are my top 5. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.